The silence in Julian's gleaming, minimalist restaurant was the loudest sound Elara had ever heard. Months later, it would be the sound of his empire crumbling, the dead air of canceled reservations, and a future turned to ash. But on that first night, the laughter had been deafening. It was the sound of her world ending, punctuated by the clinking of expensive wine glasses and the smug, dismissive curl of his lips. He thought he was delivering a verdict. He had no idea he was handing her a declaration of war. By the time she was finished, nobody in that city would be laughing at her ever again. They would be begging for a table. It was supposed to be their anniversary. 3 years. 3 years of believing in him, supporting him, loving him. He had chosen the venue, his own restaurant, Éclat. It was his monument to himself, a cold cathedral of concrete floors, stark lighting, and plates so large they made the tiny, meticulously arranged portions of food look like an apology. Elara had always found it soulless, but she had never said so. She had smiled, praised his genius, and helped him charm investors, her quiet warmth a necessary counterbalance to his chilly ambition. Tonight, she wore the simple blue dress he once said he loved, the one that matched her eyes. She felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach that had nothing to do with the anniversary. For weeks, he had been distant, his compliments edged with something sharp, his affection feeling more like a performance than a genuine emotion. He arrived at their table late, not with a kiss or a whispered apology, but with a sigh of profound weariness, as if her very presence was a burden. "We need to talk," he said, not even looking at her. He was scanning the room, his eyes flicking over the few remaining patrons, his jaw tight. Elara's heart began to beat a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "Julian, what's wrong?" He finally met her gaze, and what she saw there was not love or even irritation. It was a cold, clinical condescension. "This isn't working, Elara." The words hung in the air between them, more sterile and empty than the room itself. What do you mean? The restaurant? Is there a problem with the staff?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound she had never heard from him before, and it was terrifying. "No, not the restaurant. Us. This. It's run its course." She felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands, resting on the crisp white tablecloth, began to tremble. "You're breaking up with me? On our anniversary?" "An anniversary of what?" he sneered, his voice low and cruel. "Of you pretending to understand my world? Of me pretending you weren't holding me back?" The accusation was so stunning, so out of left field, that she couldn't form a response. Holding him back? She had poured her savings into his initial business plan, worked unpaid hours doing his books, charmed suppliers who were wary of his arrogance. She had been the foundation upon which he had built this cold, empty temple. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Of course you don't," he said, leaning forward. The curated ambiance of the restaurant seemed to fade away, leaving only the focused beam of his cruelty. "You think because your grandfather ran some greasy spoon bistro that you know anything about this world, about fine dining, about what it takes." The mention of her grandfather was a knife twist, a deliberate, calculated strike at the deepest part of her heart. Her grandfather, Thomas, and his little restaurant, the Hearth, had been her entire world. It was the place she had learned about honesty, passion, and the way food could be an act of love. "Don't you talk about him," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden surge of protective anger. "Why not?" Julian's smile was a predator's. "He was a lovely old man, a peasant cook with a good heart, but this," he gestured around the room at the stark decor and the intimidating wine list, This is art. This is ambition. It's something you could never comprehend. She stared at him, the man she thought she knew, and saw a complete stranger. A monster wearing a familiar face. I helped you build this. You helped me? He laughed again, louder this time. A few of the kitchen staff, cleaning up in the open-concept kitchen, glanced over. The sommelier paused in his polishing of a glass. They were witnesses to her execution. You filled out some spreadsheets, Elara. You smiled at people. A trained monkey could have done it. Your contribution was a rounding error. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt the sting of tears, but refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. And now, he continued, his tone shifting to one of finality, I have an opportunity, a real one, a partnership with a major hotel group. They see the vision, they see the brand, and they don't see you in the picture. So that's it? You're just throwing me away? I'm moving on, and you need to do the same. He paused, then delivered the killing blow, the phrase that would echo in her mind for months, fueling a fire she didn't even know she possessed. Look, I know you've had this silly little dream of opening your own place, some tribute to your grandfather. Let me give you some free advice. Don't. You have no palate, no ambition, no soul for this business. You're a home cook, Elara. Stay in your lane before you ruin yourself. Stay in your lane. The words were so dismissive, so utterly contemptuous, they almost didn't register. He was erasing her, not just from his future, but from her own past, belittling the one thing that had ever given her a true sense of identity. She stood up, her chair scraping against the polished concrete. Her legs felt unsteady, but her spine was rigid. She looked at him, at his perfectly tailored suit and his smug, self-satisfied face, and a strange, cold calm washed over her. The hurt was still there, a massive, gaping wound, but beneath it, something else was beginning to stir. Thank you for the advice, she said, her voice unnervingly even. He looked surprised by her composure. He had expected tears, pleading, a scene. He had wanted to see her break. I'll see myself out, she said. She turned and walked away, past the sommelier who was now staring intently at his cloth, past the kitchen staff who suddenly found the stainless steel counters fascinating. She walked out of the heavy glass doors of Éclat and into the cool night air, the sound of his laughter, now joined by a hushed chuckle from one of his staff, following her out into the street. She didn't look back. She just kept walking, the cruel phrase echoing in her head. Stay in your lane. He had no idea what lane she was about to pave. The first few days were a blur of grief. She stayed in the apartment they had shared, the one she would now have to leave. Every object was a memory. Every corner held a ghost. She had called her best friend, Chloe, from a park bench that first night, her voice finally breaking as she recounted the conversation. Chloe had been silent for a long moment before speaking, her voice a low growl. I'm coming over, and I'm bringing 2 bottles of wine and a sledgehammer. We can decide which one to use on his car later. Chloe arrived and held Elara while she cried, letting her pour out all the pain, the confusion, the white-hot humiliation. Chloe didn't offer platitudes. She just listened, her expression growing harder with every detail. A rounding error? Chloe finally said, her voice dripping with fury. That son of a bitch! I saw your bank statements. You drained your inheritance account to cover his rent for the first 6 months. You co-signed the loan for his stupid German ovens. Elara had forgotten about that. In her love-blinded haze, she had done it without a second thought. He had said it was a formality, that his credit was just temporarily tied up. She had signed the papers, her name next to his. A sickening dread began to creep through the fog of her sorrow. "Oh, God, Chloe! The loan!" Chloe's eyes widened. "We need to see that paperwork! Now!" They spent the next hour tearing through the filing cabinet in the home office. Elara found the folder, her hands shaking as she pulled out the loan agreement. Chloe, a paralegal with a razor-sharp mind, scanned the pages, her lips thinning into a grim line. "He played you, Elara," Chloe said softly. "He structured it so you're the primary guarantor. If he defaults, they come for you first. Your assets, everything." The room tilted. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a calculated demolition. He hadn't just thrown her away. He had strapped a financial time bomb to her back. He had insulated himself, using her trust as his shield. The grief that had been suffocating her began to curdle, changing into something else. Something cold and hard and heavy. Anger. A pure, undiluted rage that was terrifying in its clarity. "He said I was holding him back," Elara said, her voice flat. "He was using you as a safety net," Chloe corrected. "And now that he thinks he has a bigger one with this hotel deal, he's cut you loose. But he left you holding all the risk." Elara sank onto the floor, the loan papers clutched in her hand. The humiliation of his words, the pain of his betrayal. It all coalesced into a single burning point of focus. He hadn't just insulted her. He had insulted her grandfather's memory. He had called the legacy of the hearth a greasy spoon hobby for a peasant cook. She thought back to those summers, the scent of fresh bread, garlic, and roasting herbs that clung to her grandfather's clothes. Thomas was not a peasant cook. He was an artist, but his canvas was not a stark white plate. It was the soul of a community. The hearth was always full, not with critics and socialites, but with families, friends, lovers. People came for the food, but stayed for the feeling. It was a place of genuine connection, of warmth, of joy. Everything Éclat was not. Her grandfather had never cared for awards or fads. "Honesty, Elara," he used to say, his large, flour-dusted hands gently guiding hers as she learned to knead dough. "Food doesn't need to be complicated to be beautiful. It just needs to be honest. Honest ingredients, honest cooking, and honest price. That's the soul of it. Never forget that." Julian had no soul. He had mistaken technique for art, price for value, and ambition for passion. And he had made the fatal mistake of assuming she was just like him, only weaker. She looked up at Chloe, her eyes dry now. The tears were gone, replaced by a glint of steel. "He thinks I'm a home cook." Chloe nodded slowly, seeing the shift in her friend. "Yes." "He thinks I have no ambition." "Yes." "He told me to stay in my lane." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Chloe's face. "So what are you going to do?" Elara stood up, the loan papers crinkling in her fist. She walked over to the bookshelf and pulled down a heavy, worn, leather-bound book. It was her grandfather's ledger, his Bible. It held every recipe, every supplier contact, every business note, and every piece of wisdom he had accumulated over 40 years of running the hearth. He had given it to her on her 18th birthday. "For when you're ready," he'd said, his eyes twinkling. She opened it, the pages smelling of old paper, vanilla, and time. His familiar, elegant script filled the pages. It wasn't just a cookbook. It was a manual for a philosophy of life. "I'm going to need a lawyer," Elara said, her voice calm and clear. "A good one, and a real estate agent. And I'm going to need you to help me ruin him." Chloe's smile widened. "Gladly. Where are we starting?" Elara looked out the window in the direction of downtown, where Éclat stood like a cold, concrete tombstone. "I'm going to open a restaurant," she said, "right next door to his." The week that followed was a whirlwind of calculated action. The grief was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was no longer her master. It was fuel. Every time a wave of sadness threatened to pull her under, she would hear his voice. Rounding error, stay in your lane, and the anger would solidify into resolve. First, she moved out of the apartment. She packed her things with ruthless efficiency, leaving behind everything he had ever given her. She took only what was hers, including the high-end espresso machine she had paid for in cash. She left the key on the counter with a single, simple note. "I'll be in touch about the loan." Chloe put her in touch with a lawyer, a woman named Anya Sharma, who specialized in business litigation. Anya was sharp, impeccably dressed, and had eyes that missed nothing. Elara sat in her plush office, laid out the loan documents, and told her the entire story. Anya listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Elara finished, she tapped a long, manicured finger on the guarantee clause. "He's a predator, but a sloppy one. He assumed you'd be too heartbroken to read the fine print. That's our advantage." "What can we do?" Elara asked. "For now, we watch," Anya said. "We let him think he's gotten away with it. We monitor the loan payments. The moment he's late, even by a day, we have leverage. And from what you've told me about his new hotel deal, he's likely running on fumes. These big deals take months, sometimes years to pay out. He's probably counting on Éclat's revenue to keep him afloat. He's exposed." Next was the real estate agent, a friend of Chloe's named Marcus. He was a boisterous, cheerful man who immediately understood the theatricality of Elara's plan. "Next door to Éclat?" He'd boomed over the phone. "Oh, that's just delicious. That's Shakespearean. Let me see what I can find." The building next to Julian's was a prime piece of real estate. It had been a high-end boutique that had gone under during the pandemic. The space was vacant, the windows papered over. It was perfect. It was also prohibitively expensive. "The lease is astronomical," Marcus told her, his tone more subdued. "And the landlord requires a massive down payment and proof of significant capital reserves. It's a big risk, Elara." This was the moment of truth. This was where her silly little dream met the cold, hard reality of commerce. But as she stood outside the dusty, vacant storefront, staring at the gleaming facade of Éclat next door, she felt no fear. She felt a strange sense of destiny. She thought of her grandfather's ledger. Tucked into a back pocket of the leather cover was a slim envelope she had almost forgotten about. It contained a statement for a trust fund her grandfather had set up for her years ago. He had been shrewder than anyone knew, quietly investing the profits from his greasy spoon for decades. It wasn't a fortune, but it was substantial. It was more than enough. It was seed money. It was rocket fuel. Her grandfather had built his legacy on honest work. Julian had built his on deceit. It was time to see which foundation was stronger. "I can cover it," she told Marcus, her voice firm. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "You can? Well, all right then. Let's go get you a restaurant." While the lease negotiations were underway, Elara immersed herself in the ledger. It became her sanctuary and her war room. She didn't just read the recipes. She studied them, deconstructed them, understood the philosophy behind them. Her grandfather's notes were meticulous. "Coq au vin. The secret is not the wine, but the bacon. Use thick-cut, smoked bacon from Henderson's farm. Their pigs are happy pigs, and a happy pig makes for happy bacon. Render it slowly. Don't rush. The fat is the soul of the dish. Bouillabaisse. People think it's about the fish. It's about the broth. Fennel, saffron, a touch of orange peel. And the rui must have a kick. Use the garlic from the guy at the farmer's market with the dirt under his fingernails. That's real garlic. She realized the ledger wasn't just a collection of instructions. It was a network. It was a map of relationships her grandfather had cultivated for decades with farmers, butchers, fishermen, and vintners. These were not faceless suppliers. They were partners. People who cared about their product as much as he did. She spent her days on the phone, tracking them down. Some had retired, but many of their children or grandchildren had taken over the family businesses. She introduced herself as Thomas's granddaughter, and it was like a magic key. The tone of the conversation would shift instantly. Voices would warm. Memories would be shared. Thomas? Of course, I remember him. He taught my father how to properly butcher a lamb. The hearth. My mother still talks about his apple tart. Said it was the only thing that tasted like home. She wasn't just securing suppliers. She was reactivating a legacy. She was gathering an army that didn't even know it was one. In the evenings, she and Chloe would huddle over architectural plans. The interior of the new restaurant would be the antithesis of Éclat. No concrete, no stark lighting. She wanted warm woods, soft upholstery, an open kitchen that felt like a hearth, and a long, welcoming bar. She wanted the space to feel like a hug. She would call it the hearth, of course. There was no other name. One night, as they were looking at fabric swatches, Chloe's phone buzzed. It was a text from her friend in commercial real estate. Chloe read it, and a slow, wicked grin spread across her face. "What is it?" Elara asked. Chloe held up the phone. "A little birdie told me that Julian's big hotel deal just hit a snag. The financing is shaky. The board is getting cold feet." Elara felt a jolt of fierce, triumphant satisfaction. "So he's vulnerable." "More than vulnerable," Chloe said, her eyes gleaming. "He's desperate. He needs Éclat to look like the hottest ticket in town to keep his investors from bolting. He's a house of cards in a hurricane." Elara looked at the plans for the hearth spread out on the table. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was the hurricane. The day the lease was signed, Elara felt a profound sense of rightness. She stood in the dusty, empty space, the keys heavy in her hand. Through the papered-over window, she could see the entrance to Éclat. She saw Julian stride out, talking on his phone, a frown creasing his brow. He glanced at the vacant storefront for a second, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the empty space next to his masterpiece, and then dismissed it, turning his attention back to his call. He had no idea. He was looking at his own grave, and he didn't even know it. The construction began the next day. The sound of saws and hammers filled the air, a percussive announcement of her arrival. It was only a matter of time before he noticed. It took him 2 weeks. 2 weeks of construction crews, of deliveries of lumber and pipe, of the unmistakable signs of a major renovation happening right under his nose. Elara had been on site, conferring with the contractor, when she saw him storm out of Éclat. He marched across the few feet of sidewalk that separated their properties and stopped, staring at the flurry of activity. His eyes scanned the scene until they landed on her. She was wearing old jeans, a paint-splattered t-shirt, and a hard hat. She looked nothing like the woman in the blue dress he had discarded. He stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief, which slowly morphed into derisive amusement. He walked right up to her, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the dusty pavement. "Well, well, well," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you. What is this, Elara? A little bakery? A coffee shop?" She met his gaze without flinching. "It's a restaurant, Julian." He threw his head back and laughed, It was the same cruel, dismissive laugh she had heard on their anniversary. The sound grated on her nerves, but she kept her expression neutral. "A restaurant?" he said, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "Oh, that's rich. You're actually going through with it. You're going to open your little tribute act to Grandpa's diner." "It's called The Hearth," she said calmly. "The Hearth," he repeated, savoring the word like a bad taste. How quaint, how sentimental, how utterly doomed. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though it was loud enough for the nearby construction workers to hear. "Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to pour every last cent you have into this place. You'll struggle for a few months, drowning in debt, realizing you're in way over your head. The stress will ruin you, and then you'll close. Quietly. I give you 6 months. Tops." He straightened up, his smirk returning. "I almost feel sorry for you. You're like a child playing with matches in a dynamite factory. But I did warn you. I told you to stay in your lane." He was so confident, so utterly sure of her failure. He saw her inheritance, her passion, her grandfather's legacy as nothing more than a fool's errand. He saw her as weak, emotional, and incompetent. It was the same fatal miscalculation he had been making all along. He was so blinded by his own arrogance that he couldn't see the army she was assembling, the foundation she was laying. She gave him a small, enigmatic smile. "Thank you for your concern, Julian, but I think I'll be just fine." Her calm defiance seemed to infuriate him more than any outburst would have. His face darkened. "We'll see about that. This block isn't big enough for the both of us, and I was here first." He turned on his heel and stalked back to his restaurant, a king returning to his castle, convinced he had just put down a peasant uprising. A grizzled foreman who had overheard the exchange walked over to her. "Sorry you had to deal with that, miss. What a piece of work." Elara watched Julian disappear into Éclat. "Don't be sorry," she said, turning back to the foreman and pointing at a blueprint. "He just poured the foundation for me. Now, let's talk about the ventilation for the kitchen. I want it to be perfect." The foreman grinned. "Yes, ma'am." The final provocation solidified everything for her. Any lingering trace of doubt, any whisper of guilt about her motives, was incinerated by the heat of his condescension. This was no longer just about avenging her broken heart. It was about defending her grandfather's honor. It was about proving that value wasn't determined by a price tag, that soul was more important than style, and that he had grossly, catastrophically, underestimated her. The next few months were a blur of intense, focused work. Elara lived and breathed the hearth. She was the first one on site in the morning and the last to leave at night. She oversaw every detail, from the grain of the wooden tables to the weight of the silverware. She hired her staff not based on their resumes from Michelin-starred restaurants, but on their passion and their attitude. She looked for people with kind eyes and a love for food. Her head chef, Maria, was a woman in her 50s who had been sous chef at a respected hotel for 20 years, constantly passed over for promotions in favor of younger, flashier men. When Elara interviewed her and spoke of her grandfather's philosophy of honest food, Maria's eyes had lit up with a fire Elara recognized. "They don't want honest food anymore," Maria had said, her voice tinged with frustration. "They want foams and gels and things that look good on Instagram but taste like nothing. They've forgotten what it's like to make someone feel happy with a plate of food." "I haven't forgotten," Elara said, "and I don't think people have forgotten how to eat it either." She hired Maria on the spot. Together, they refined the menu, using her grandfather's ledger as their guide. They weren't reinventing the wheel. They were perfecting it. The perfect roast chicken, with crispy skin and juicy meat. A beef bourguignon that simmered for 8 hours until it was so tender it melted on the tongue. A simple fish, pan-seared, served with lemon, butter, and fresh herbs. It was food you wanted to eat, not just admire. Meanwhile, Julian was escalating his silent war. He tried to poach her suppliers, offering them more money. But the relationships her grandfather had built, and that she had so carefully rekindled, were stronger than a few extra dollars. Henderson's farm politely declined to sell him their bacon. The fisherman with the best scallops laughed and said he was already committed. He tried to sabotage her permits, making anonymous complaints to the city about noise violations and zoning issues. But Anya, her lawyer, was always one step ahead, ensuring every piece of paperwork was ironclad. The complaints were dismissed, one by one. He was fighting a conventional war, using money and intimidation. He didn't understand that Elara was fighting a guerrilla war, using loyalty, passion, and a deep, authentic connection to her cause. One particular entry in her grandfather's ledger became her secret weapon. Tucked in the back, on a page yellowed with age, was a note about a specific type of chanterelle mushroom that grew for only a few weeks a year in a small, hidden patch of forest about 2 hours outside the city. The land was owned by an old farmer named Silas, a close friend of her grandfather's. "Silas is gold," her grandfather had written. "The most incredible flavor, earthy, floral, almost like apricots. He only harvests a few pounds a year. They will transform any dish they touch. More valuable than truffles if you know what to do with them." Elara had driven out to meet Silas, now a stooped man in his late 80s, with eyes as clear as a summer sky. He remembered her grandfather fondly. She told him her plan, and he had listened, nodding slowly. She asked if he would be willing to sell her his entire harvest of chanterelles for her opening week. Silas had smiled, a slow, wrinkled grin. "Thomas always said his food was a secret whispered from the earth. Sounds like you're ready to do some whispering of your own. They're all yours, girl." She had secured the one ingredient no amount of money could buy, an ingredient Julian didn't even know existed. The grand opening was set for a Friday night in October. The hearth was beautiful. The warm light spilled out onto the sidewalk, a stark contrast to the cold, bluish glow from Éclat next door. The scent of roasting garlic and fresh bread wafted through the air, an irresistible invitation. Elara hadn't spent a dime on traditional advertising. Instead, she and Chloe had orchestrated a quiet, brilliant social media campaign. They sent personal invitations to local food bloggers, not the big-name critics, but the smaller, passionate ones. They told the story of the hearth, of her grandfather, of the philosophy of honest food. They didn't promise a revolution. They promised a homecoming. The night of the opening, Julian stood by his window, watching. He saw the people arriving at her door. He likely recognized a few of the food bloggers and scoffed. He saw the warm, inviting light and probably dismissed it as amateurish. He saw her greeting people at the door, her face glowing with a mixture of nerves and excitement. He had made sure his own restaurant was fully booked. He had even comped a few tables for influential people, wanting to create a scene of overwhelming success right next to her expected failure. He was orchestrating a public execution, and he had cast himself as the star. The most influential food critic in the city, a notoriously hard-to-please man named Alistair Finch, was one of Julian's invited guests. Finch's review could make or break a restaurant. Julian had been courting him for months. His arrival was the cornerstone of Julian's plan for the evening. Elara knew Finch was next door. Chloe had told her. It was the one variable she couldn't control. But as she looked around her bustling, happy dining room, filled with the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses, she felt a sense of peace. She had done the work. She had been true to her grandfather's legacy. The rest was out of her hands. The showdown began not with a bang, but with a scent. Alistair Finch, on his way into Éclat, paused on the sidewalk. He was a tall, imposing man with an air of perpetual disappointment. He stopped, tilted his head, and sniffed the air. The rich, complex aroma of Maria's beef bourguignon, the sharp, herbaceous scent of the chimichurri for the steak, the sweet, yeasty smell of fresh bread, it all mingled into an olfactory siren song. He looked at the entrance to Éclat. Then he looked at the warm, glowing entrance to the hearth. He could hear the laughter from inside. He saw a waiter carry a plate of golden brown roast chicken to a table, steam rising from it. It was simple. It was real. Julian, seeing Finch hesitate, came to the door. "Alistair, good to see you. We have your table ready?" Finch didn't look at him. His eyes were fixed on the hearth. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Oh, that?" Julian said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Just some little bistro. Sentimental nonsense. The real art is in here." But Finch was already walking away from him. He was walking towards the hearth. Julian's face went pale. He started to follow, then stopped, realizing how desperate it would look. He could only watch in horror as the city's most powerful critic, the man he had staked his evening on, walked into his rival's restaurant. Elara saw him enter. Her heart leapt into her throat. Chloe, who was manning the host stand, handled it with perfect grace. "Good evening, sir. I'm so sorry, but we're fully booked tonight." Finch looked around the room, his experienced eyes taking in every detail. The happy faces of the diners, the relaxed efficiency of the staff, the simple, beautiful plates of food. "I see," he said. He looked at Chloe. "I am Alistair Finch." He said it not as a demand, but as a simple statement of fact. "It's an honor to have you, Mr. Finch," Chloe said smoothly. "But our other guests made their reservations in advance. Perhaps you'd like to have a drink at the bar? We might have a cancellation." It was a masterful move. She treated him with respect, but didn't grovel. She honored the guests they already had. Finch, a man used to people falling over themselves to accommodate him, looked taken aback, and then impressed. "Very well," he said, and made his way to the bar. Elara, watching from the edge of the kitchen, knew this was the moment. She went to Chef Maria. "Alistair Finch is at the bar," she whispered. Maria's eyes widened, then narrowed with determination. "The chanterelles," she said. "The chanterelles," Elara agreed. They didn't send him a grand, complimentary platter. They sent him one perfect dish, a small plate of handmade pasta, tossed in brown butter and sage, and topped with 3 perfectly seared chanterelles from Silas's farm. Silas's gold. It was simple, elegant, and something he could not get anywhere else in the city. Finch ate the first bite. He closed his eyes. He took another. He savored it. He finished the plate, then ordered a full-sized portion, along with the beef bourguignon and the apple tart. He stayed for 2 hours, sitting at the bar, observing, eating, and taking notes in a small black book. Next door, Julian was unraveling. He kept looking at his own reservation system, at the empty table set for Alistair Finch. He paced. He snapped at his staff. The atmosphere in Éclat, already chilly, became glacial. The diners could feel the tension. The performance was failing. Around 10 o'clock, a buzz went through the hearth. Phones started lighting up. Chloe grabbed Elara's arm, her face ecstatic. "He posted," she breathed. Finch posted his review, live from the bar. She showed Elara the screen. It was a long, glowing post on his influential blog. He praised the warmth of the room, the professionalism of the staff, the deep, soulful honesty of the food. He wrote about the beef bourguignon, calling it a hug in a bowl. He waxed poetic about the chanterelles, describing them as a taste of forgotten magic. And then came the final paragraph, the one that would change everything. For years, our city's dining scene has been dominated by chefs who chase trends, who confuse complexity with quality. They build cold temples to their own egos and forget that the purpose of a restaurant is to feed people, body, and soul. The hearth is a quiet, powerful rebellion against all of that. Its owner, Elara Vale, has not tried to reinvent cuisine. She has remembered it. In a world telling everyone to be something new, she has chosen to be something true. While some chefs are desperately trying to find the next big thing, Elara Vale has found her lane, and she is paving it with gold. Found her lane? The inversion of Julian's insult, broadcast to the entire city by its most respected culinary voice, was so perfect, so devastating, it took Elara's breath away. It was more than a victory. It was poetry. The immediate effect was electric. The reservation phone at the hearth started ringing and didn't stop. Chloe had to take it off the hook. People were looking up the review, their faces breaking into smiles. A wave of communal joy swept through the room. And then came the silence. It started next door. Elara looked through her front window, across the sidewalk to Éclat. She could see Julian standing near his host stand, staring at his tablet, his face ashen. A diner at a table near the window, a well-known businessman, was reading his phone. He abruptly signaled for the check, even though his main course had just arrived. Another couple did the same. A notification popped up on Julian's tablet. A cancellation, then another, and another. The sound of his world collapsing wasn't a scream. It was a series of quiet digital chimes, each one a nail in his coffin. He looked up, his eyes wild with panic, and met Elara's gaze from across the street. He saw her standing there, in her warm, vibrant, successful restaurant. He saw her, the home cook, the rounding error, the woman he had told to stay in her lane. And in her calm, steady gaze, he saw his own ruin. He didn't shout. He didn't scream. He just stood there, frozen, as his customers began to walk out of his restaurant, some of them glancing curiously, hopefully, at the door of the hearth, wondering if they could possibly get a table. The silence from his dining room, the dead air of failure, was finally louder than the joyful noise in hers. The laughter had stopped. The aftermath was a slow-motion demolition. Finch's review went viral. It was the story of the year in the city's food scene. The underdog, the legacy, the arrogant celebrity chef getting his comeuppance. It was irresistible. Every newspaper, magazine, and blogger wanted a piece of the hearth. They wanted a piece of Elara. The hearth was booked solid for the next 6 months. Elara had to hire more staff, both in the kitchen and front of house. She promoted Maria to executive chef, giving her full creative control and a salary that brought tears to the older woman's eyes. She set up a profit-sharing plan for all her employees. She was building a business, but she was also building a community, just as her grandfather had. Julian, meanwhile, was in a freefall. His investors, already spooked by the stalled hotel deal, saw the public humiliation and the exodus of customers as the final straw. They pulled their funding. The bank called in its loans. His suppliers, many of whom he had treated poorly for years, demanded immediate payment. This was when Anya, Elara's lawyer, made her move. Julian, in his financial panic, missed a payment on the loan Elara had co-signed. He was 1 day late. That's all Anya needed. She filed a notice of default, but instead of going after his assets, she offered him a deal. Elara would assume the full debt of the loan herself, releasing him from his obligation. In exchange, he had to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a legal release, acknowledging that her initial investment in his business had been a convertible note, which she was now cashing out for a symbolic 1% stake in his failing company. It was a brilliant, cruel move. It wasn't about the money, it was about the principle. It forced him to legally acknowledge her contribution, the very thing he had so cruelly dismissed as a rounding error. He was so desperate to avoid the bank coming after him personally that he signed it without a fight. He had no idea that Anya had already ascertained his company was worthless. The 1% stake was nothing but a final, elegant twist of the knife. A few weeks later, Éclat closed its doors. A simple printed sign was taped to the window. Closed for business. The cold, minimalist interior gathered dust. Elara saw Julian one last time. She was leaving the hearth late one night, and he was standing across the street, just staring at the darkened facade of his failed dream. He looked smaller, diminished. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by the stoop of defeat. He wore a rumpled jacket and looked like he hadn't slept in days. He saw her, and for a moment, his face contorted with a flash of the old hatred. But it faded quickly, leaving behind only a hollow emptiness. He didn't say anything. He just turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Elara didn't feel a surge of triumph. She didn't feel glee or satisfaction. She just felt quiet. It was over. The wound he had inflicted was still a scar, but it no longer ached. She had not erased the hurt. She had transformed it into something strong and beautiful. She went back inside the hearth. The staff was gone. The dining room was quiet. She walked into the kitchen, the heart of it all. She ran her hand over the warm, stainless steel counter. She opened her grandfather's ledger, which she kept on a special shelf in the kitchen office. Tucked into the very back, she found something she had never seen before. A sealed envelope with her name on it in his familiar script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was a letter, written years ago. "My dearest Elara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have finally found your way back to the kitchen. I always knew you would. You have a fire in you, a love for this craft that is truer than you know. The world will try to tell you what you should be. It will praise things that are complicated and expensive and shiny. It will dismiss things that are simple and honest and true. Do not listen. Your heart is your best compass. It knows the way. Cook with love, live with courage, and never, ever let anyone make you feel small for caring about the things that truly matter. Your legacy is not in what you build, but in the joy you create. I am so proud of you. Love, Grandpa Thomas." Tears streamed down her face as she read the letter. They were not tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of gratitude, of release, of love. Her grandfather had seen her, truly seen her, all along. He had known the path she would have to walk. He had left her a map, not just to a successful restaurant, but to a successful life. She folded the letter and placed it back in the ledger. She looked around the quiet kitchen, at the gleaming pots and pans, at the silent stoves waiting for the morning. She had not just won a battle against Julian. She had won a battle for herself. She had claimed her inheritance, her identity, her power, and she was just getting started. 1 year later, the hearth was not just a success. It was an institution. It had been awarded Restaurant of the Year by the city's most prominent magazine. Maria was a celebrated chef in her own right, her face beaming from magazine covers. The hearth had become a symbol of the city's culinary renaissance, a return to authenticity and quality. Elara had expanded. She didn't open another restaurant. Instead, she bought the now-defunct space where Éclat had been. She had knocked down the wall between the two properties, not to make the hearth bigger, but to build the Hearth Culinary School. It was a small, intimate school, dedicated to her grandfather's philosophy. She taught classes on honest cooking, on building relationships with suppliers, on running a business with soul. She established a scholarship fund for aspiring chefs from low-income backgrounds, ensuring that talent, not wealth, was the only prerequisite for entry. She was no longer just a restaurateur. She was a leader, a mentor, a force for good in her community. The profits from the restaurant and the school were substantial, but the true wealth was in the lives she was changing. And what of her antagonists? Their downfall was as complete as her rise was meteoric. Julian's bankruptcy was messy and public. He had lied to his investors and was facing multiple lawsuits. The last Chloe had heard, he was working as a line cook in a chain hotel restaurant in another state. The ultimate indignity for a man who had once called himself an artist. He was anonymous, forgotten, a ghost in a hairnet. His mother, Isabel, who had once sneered at Elara over the phone, found her social standing evaporated. The story of her son's cruelty and Elara's triumph was the talk of every charity gala and country club. To be associated with the name Julian Thorne was to be associated with failure and disgrace. She had retreated from public life, her status turning to ash alongside her son's career. Elara rarely thought of them anymore. Her life was too full, too rich, too joyful. She had found a new rhythm, one that was not dictated by anger or revenge, but by passion and purpose. One crisp autumn afternoon, a man came into the hearth. It was early, before the dinner rush, and Elara was having a cup of tea at the bar. He was tall, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He said he was an architect and had been admiring the design of the space. "You managed to make it feel both classic and completely modern," he said, his appreciation genuine. "It feels happy in here." His name was Liam. They talked for an hour about architecture and food, about the importance of creating spaces that made people feel good. He didn't know who she was at first, and when he found out, he was impressed not by her fame, but by her story, by her resilience. He didn't want anything from her. He was simply drawn to her light. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was slow, steady, and built on a foundation of mutual respect and admiration. It was the kind of love she had always deserved. Liam loved her for her strength, her passion, her kind heart. He loved the fire in her, the same fire her grandfather had seen. He never once told her to stay in her lane. He was too busy admiring the road she was building. 2 years after that terrible anniversary dinner, Elara stood at the pass in her bustling kitchen, a symphony of controlled chaos swirling around her. The air was thick with the scent of searing scallops, roasting vegetables, and simmering sauces. Laughter and conversation spilled in from the dining room. Next door, in the culinary school, a new class of students was learning how to make the perfect loaf of bread. Liam came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Everything okay?" he murmured. She leaned back against him, a deep sense of peace settling over her. She looked at the happy, focused faces of her staff, at the beautiful plates of food waiting to go out, at the vibrant, thriving world she had built from the ashes of her heartbreak. She had learned that the most valuable inheritances were not money or property, but knowledge and self-worth. She had learned that a legacy of love was more powerful than an empire of ego, and she had learned to stop accepting disrespect disguised as advice. She had found her lane, not by staying in it, but by building a new road entirely, one that led directly to the life she was always meant to live. Everything, she said, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable joy, is perfect.